The rain in Oakhaven didn't just fall, it punished the earth. It hammered against the stained-glass windows of the First Baptist Church with the relentless rhythm of a drummer marching men to the gallows. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew a suffocating chowder of damp wool, beeswax candles, nervous sweat, and the cloying scent of lilacs that Eleanor's stepmother had doused her in to mask the smell of the wet dog that seemed to permeate the entire town. Eleanor Prentice stood at the altar, her hands clasping a bouquet of wilting daisies, so tightly the stems were turning to mush in her grip. She stared fixedly at the polished toes of Thomas Miller's boots. She didn't dare look up. If she looked up, she would see the faces in the pews. She would see Mrs. Gable whispering behind her fan, her eyes darting over the expanse of Eleanor's back. She would see the miners snickering, making bets on whether the floorboards would hold. She knew what they saw. They didn't see Eleanor, the woman who could bake a cherry pie that made grown men weep, or the woman who could stitch a quilt in 3 days. They saw the barrel. They saw Big Ellie. They saw 300 pounds of flesh squeezed painfully into a cream-colored silk dress that had been let out at the seams so many times the fabric was starting to fray. The corset beneath was a cage of whalebone and steel, digging into her ribs, pushing her ample bosom up until it felt obscene, restricting her breath to shallow panic sips. Thomas shifted his weight beside her. He was a small man, wiry and nervous, with eyes like a ferret. He wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip. He wasn't marrying her for love. Everyone knew that. He was marrying her because her father, the town's only miller, had promised a dowry of $500 and a share in the grain profits. Thomas needed a new roof for his dry goods store. Eleanor was simply the toll he had to pay to get it. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Holloway droned, his voice reedy and thin, struggling to compete with the thunder rolling overhead. "We are gathered here today." Eleanor felt a bead of sweat trickle down her spine, cold and sharp. "Just let it be over," she prayed silently. "Just let him say, 'I do,' so I can go home and take off this dress and hide in the kitchen." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Thomas Edward Miller, do you take this woman?" Thomas flinched. It was a small movement, but Eleanor felt it like a slap. He looked over his shoulder at the congregation. A low ripple of laughter had started in the back row, the row where the drunkards and the layabouts sat. "Looks like a toothpick trying to spear a pot roast," someone whispered loud enough to be heard. Thomas turned red. The laughter spread, a contagion of cruelty. "Do you take this woman?" the Reverend repeated, a little louder, a little more desperate. "To be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas looked at Eleanor. For the first time all day, he looked her in the eye. She saw panic there. But worse than panic, she saw disgust. He looked at the swell of her stomach against the silk. He looked at her round, pale face, her double chin, the soft, heavy flesh of her arms. Thomas's voice cracked. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. The rain lashed the roof. Thrum, thrum, thrum. "I can't," Thomas whispered. Eleanor stopped breathing. Her heart gave a painful, lurching thud against her ribs. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't do it," Thomas said, his voice rising, gaining the pitch of hysteria. He stepped back, pulling his hand away from hers, as if she were contagious. He turned to the crowd, spreading his hands in a plea for understanding. "Look at her. Just look at her. I can't be expected to lie with that. I'd be the laughingstock of the county. She's a monster." The word hung in the air, suspended in the candlelight. Monster. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The floor seemed to tilt. She swayed, her knees locking to keep her upright. The humiliation was absolute. It was a physical thing, a hot iron branding her chest. The church erupted into gasps and murmurs, but nobody stood up. Nobody shouted shame. They were enjoying the show. "I'm sorry, Mr. Prentice," Thomas yelled at Eleanor's father in the front row. "Keep your money. It ain't worth the wait." Thomas turned to flee, to run down the aisle and escape the scene he had created. Bam! The heavy oak doors of the church didn't just open, they exploded inward, caught by a gust of wind and a massive hand. The storm blew in, extinguishing the candles in the back half of the nave. A swirl of dead leaves and rain danced across the floorboards. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray fury of the sky, was a mountain. It was a man, but he seemed larger than any man had a right to be. He filled the frame, his shoulders brushing the jambs. He wore a coat made from the pelt of a grizzly bear, the fur matted and dark with rain, shaking water onto the floor like a wet beast. Beneath the hood of the coat, a beard as black and tangled as a briar patch hid his face, leaving only a pair of eyes, visible eyes the color of gunmetal and just as cold. Thaddeus Kincaid, the bear. The town knew him. He came down from the high peaks twice a year to trade furs for ammunition and salt. He never spoke. He never stayed. Rumor had it he had killed a man in Abilene with his bare hands. Rumor had it he had survived a winter by sleeping inside the carcass of an elk. He stood there, dripping, a rifle slung over his shoulder, a hunting knife the size of a short sword at his hip. He looked at the frozen scene, the weeping bride, the fleeing groom, the gaping crowd. Thomas, who was halfway down the aisle, skidded to a halt. He was blocked. To get out, he had to go past the bear. "Excuse me," Thomas squeaked, trying to sidestep the giant. I have to go." Thaddeus didn't move his feet. He simply reached out a hand that looked like a bundle of roots and leather, and placed it on Thomas's chest. He didn't push. He just held him there. "You made a promise," Thaddeus rumbled. His voice was a subterranean growl, vibrating through the floorboards, deeper than the thunder. She's too fat," Thomas blurted out, pointing back at Eleanor, desperation making him reckless. "Look at the size of her. I can't marry that. It ain't natural." Thaddeus looked over Thomas's head. He looked down the aisle to the altar. Eleanor was standing alone. She wasn't crying. She was too shattered to cry. She stood like a statue of grief, her large hands trembling, her face pale as milk. She looked like a dove trapped in a cage of silk, waiting for the hawk to strike. Thaddeus looked at her. He saw the way she tried to hold herself together. He saw the softness of her, the sheer, undeniable abundance of her presence in a room full of sharp, starving, cruel people. He looked back down at Thomas. His lip curled, revealing teeth that looked too white in the gloom. "You throw away the grain because the sack is heavy?" Thaddeus asked. It was a strange question, spoken slowly, as if testing the words. What?" Thomas stammered. Thaddeus grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his cheap suit. With a grunt of exertion that sounded like a shifting tectonic plate, he lifted the shopkeeper off the ground. He turned and threw him. He didn't throw him far, just enough to send him sprawling into a pew, knocking over a hymnal rack with a chaotic clatter. "Get out," Thaddeus said. Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up, scurried around the giant, and vanished into the rain. The church was deadly silent now. The reverend was trembling behind the pulpit. Thaddeus began to walk. Thud, thud, thud. His heavy boots left muddy prints on the pristine runner. He walked with a predator's grace, slow and inevitable. The water dripping from his coat hissed as he passed the candles. He stopped at the altar. He towered over Eleanor. Up close he smelled of pine resin, wet fur, and old blood. He was terrifying, a savage, a creature from the nightmares of the civilized world. Eleanor looked up, her breath hitching. She waited for the mockery. She waited for him to laugh, to finish what Thomas had started. Thaddeus looked down at her. He looked at the tears finally spilling over her lashes. He looked at the pulse fluttering wildly in her throat. "I have a claim," Thaddeus said to her, his voice low, meant only for her. "High Ridge. Railroad wants it. Need a wife to hold the deed. Need a partner to work the season." He paused, water dripping from his beard onto the lace of her bodice. "I am not a shopkeeper," he rumbled. "I do not sell, I keep." He turned to the Reverend. "Preacher." Yes, Mr. Kincaid," the Reverend squeaked. "Finish it." "But the groom is gone." "I am here," Thaddeus said. He reached out and took Eleanor's hand. His hand swallowed hers completely. Her skin was soft, hot, and damp. His was callous, cold, and hard as rock. "But the license, the names." Thaddeus reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of gold dust, more than Thomas would have made in 5 lifetimes. He dropped it on the altar. "Change the name," Thaddeus commanded. He looked back at Eleanor. He squeezed her hand, not painfully, but with a pressure that grounded her, that stopped the room from spinning. "Do you?" he asked her. Eleanor stared at him. She looked at the scars on his face, the wildness in his eyes. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had thrown the man who shamed her into a pew. He was a monster who was holding her hand as if it were precious, not heavy. She had a choice. Stay here, be the laughingstock, the spinster, the heifer of Oakhaven, or walk into the storm with the bear. Eleanor's voice was a whisper. She cleared her throat. She squeezed his hand back. "I do." "I do," Thaddeus grunted. He didn't wait for the Reverend to pronounce them. He didn't wait for a kiss. He turned to the congregation, glaring at them with a look that dared anyone to breathe. Then he shrugged the massive bear fur coat off his shoulders. It was heavy, weighing at least 50 pounds. He swung it around Eleanor. It engulfed her. The fur was warm from his body heat. It hid the tightness of the dress. It hid the curves the town mocked. It wrapped her in darkness and the scent of the wild. "Come," Thaddeus said. He kept his arm around her shoulders, shielding her, and led her down the aisle. They walked past the stunned faces, past her open-mouthed father, and out the shattered doors. The rain hit them instantly, cold and biting. But under the bearskin, pressed against the side of the mountain man, Eleanor didn't feel the cold. She felt the terrifying electric jolt of a life that had just veered off a cliff and into the unknown. The mud of the churchyard sucked at the hem of her silk dress, a greedy, wet sound that marked the end of her life as Eleanor Prentice. Thaddeus didn't stop at a carriage or a buggy. He walked straight to a massive roan draft horse tethered to the iron fence, a beast that looked more like a siege engine than a mount, its coat shaggy and steaming in the cold rain. "Up," Thaddeus grunted. It wasn't a request. Eleanor stared at the animal. The stirrup was level with her chest. She was encased in 20 yards of wet silk, a steel corset that was currently bruising her ribs, and 3 layers of petticoats that felt like they weighed as much as lead shot. I can't," she whispered, the rain plastering her hair to her forehead. "The dress, my weight." Thaddeus didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes the way Thomas would have. He simply turned, planted his boots wide in the slush, and gripped her waist. His hands were enormous, spanning the distance from her ribs to her hips. He didn't struggle. He didn't groan. He lifted her with a sudden hydraulic surge of power that stole the breath from her lungs, depositing her sideways onto the saddle blanket before she could even gasp. He swung himself up behind her in one fluid motion, the leather creaking under their combined mass. "Hold the pommel," he instructed, his voice a rumble against her back. "Don't let go." The journey out of Oakhaven was a blur of gray misery, but as they left the valley floor and began the ascent into the timberline, the misery sharpened into a terrifying clarity. The air grew thin and bitingly cold, turning the rain into stinging sleet. The road dissolved into a deer trail that wound precariously along the edge of sheer granite drop-offs. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut. Every time the horse's hoof slipped on a wet stone, her heart hammered against her throat. She was keenly aware of the man behind her. He was a furnace. His chest was a solid, unyielding wall against her back, radiating a heat that seeped through the damp silk of her gown. His arms, thick as tree limbs in the bare fur coat, caged her in, holding the reins with a loose, competent grip. He didn't speak. Not once. For 3 hours. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the pines, the heavy, rhythmic clop-clop of the horse, and the occasional sharp intake of breath from Eleanor when the trail narrowed. She felt his chin brush against the top of her head occasionally, a rough, accidental intimacy that made her shiver more than the cold. By the time the horse crested the final ridge, dusk had fallen, turning the world to a bruised purple. "Home," Thaddeus said. The word was flat, devoid of sentiment. Eleanor opened her eyes. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Built directly into the side of a limestone cliff, the cabin was constructed of logs so massive they must have been dragged by a team of oxen. The roof was low and sod-covered, blending into the mountain. There were no welcoming lanterns, no flower boxes, just a dark, brooding structure that looked like it was hunkering down against an assault. Thaddeus halted the horse and slid off. He reached up and pulled Eleanor down. Her legs gave way the moment her boots hit the ground, numb from the cold and the awkward position. Thaddeus caught her by the elbow, steadying her effortlessly. "Inside," he commanded, pointing to the heavy oak door. "Storm's turning." He led the horse away toward a lean-to shelter, leaving her alone in the howling wind. Eleanor stumbled to the door, her frozen fingers fumbling with the iron latch. She pushed it open and fell inside. The interior was pitch black and freezing. It smelled of stale grease, cured leather, and the sharp metallic tang of gun oil. Eleanor stood in the darkness, shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She heard the door creak open behind her, blocking out the wind, and then the heavy thud of a wooden bar dropping into place. A match flared. Thaddeus lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a hook. The yellow light washed over the room. It was a single large space, dominated by a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole hog. The walls were lined with shelves packed with jars, tools, and pelts. In one corner stood a narrow bed with a straw-tick mattress in the loft above, a pile of furs. It was stark. It was utilitarian. It was a bachelor's den of survival. Thaddeus moved past her, ignoring her presence, to kneel at the hearth. He struck a flint, nursing a spark into a pile of dry moss, and kindling until a fire roared to life, chasing back the shadows. Only then did he turn to look at her. Eleanor stood near the door, a ridiculous figure in a mud-stained wet wedding dress, clutching the bear coat around her like a shield. She felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the leering look of the town men, nor the disgust of Thomas. It was the look a man gives a tool he isn't sure how to use. "Why?" Eleanor whispered, the question bursting out of her before she could stop it. Why did you take me?" Thaddeus stood up, dusting ash from his knees. He walked over to a table and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, the land deed. "Homestead Act," he said, his voice gravelly. "Railroad wants this ridge. They say a single man can't hold 1,000 acres. They say I'm a squatter." He smoothed the paper on the table with a thick finger. "Married man gets double the claim. Law says so. You are. Legal protection." Eleanor felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. A business transaction. "Survival," Thaddeus corrected. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You need it out. I needed a signature. We are even." He turned away, walking to the larder. "I sleep in the loft. You take the bed. Don't come up the ladder." He pulled out a strip of dried venison jerky and tossed it onto the table. "Eat." Then, without another word, he grabbed a lantern and went out the back door, presumably to check his traps or tend to the horse. Eleanor was alone. She stared at the jerky. She stared at the rough bed. The tears finally came, hot and stinging. She sank onto a wooden stool, the silk of her dress pooling on the dirty floorboards. Even, she was a human shield against a railroad company, a prop. She looked down at her hands, her large, soft, capable hands. They were trembling. "No," she thought, "I will not cry. Thomas called me a monster. The town called me a burden. I will not be a burden here." She wiped her eyes fiercely. She stood up. The corset was killing her. She reached behind her, struggling with the laces, gasping until she managed to loosen them enough to breathe. She looked around the grim cabin. It was cold. It was messy. It was a place where a man merely existed, waiting to die. But in the corner she saw a barrel. Eleanor walked over to it. She pried off the lid. Flour. White, powdery, soft flour. Next to it, a crock jar that smelled sour and alive, sourdough starter. A spark of defiance lit in Eleanor's chest. She might be fat. She might be a fake wife, but she was the daughter of a miller, and she knew how to make things rise. She found a heavy ceramic bowl. She found water in a bucket. She rolled up the sleeves of her ruined wedding dress, exposing her thick, pale forearms. She plunged her hands into the flour. The sensation grounded her. The cool dust, the sticky starter. She began to knead. She put her weight into it, the weight everyone despised, using her shoulders, her back, her strength to work the dough. She stoked the fire, finding the cast-iron Dutch oven. She greased it with a tin of lard. For an hour, the only sound in the cabin was the rhythmic thump, slap, thump of the dough against the table and the crackle of the fire. When Thaddeus returned, the storm was raging in full force outside, shaking the heavy door on its hinges. He stomped the snow from his boots, carrying a brace of skinned rabbits, looking frozen to the bone. He stopped dead in the doorway. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the smell of damp fur or stale grease. It was the smell of heaven. Warm, yeasty, slightly charred, sweet breath of baking bread. He looked at the table. Eleanor was standing there. She had found an old apron and tied it over her wedding dress. Her face was flushed from the heat of the fire, strands of hair escaping her pins. On the table sat a loaf of bread. It was huge, golden brown, the crust crackling as it cooled. Thaddeus dropped the rabbits on the floor. He stared at the bread, as if it were a hallucination. He hadn't seen fresh, leavened bread in 2 years. He lived on hardtack and meat. Eleanor started, suddenly nervous under his intense stare. "I found the flour. I thought, you might be hungry." Thaddeus walked to the table. He moved slowly, like a man approaching a trap. He reached out a scarred hand and touched the loaf. It was hot, real. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at her flour-dusted arms, the way she filled the space in the kitchen, not with clutter, but with presence, with warmth. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. He pulled a knife from his belt, sliced a massive wedge of the bread, and bit into it. He closed his eyes. His shoulders, which were perpetually hunched in a defensive posture, dropped an inch. He chewed slowly, savoring the softness, the slight tang of the sourdough, the crunch of the crust. He let out a breath that was almost a groan. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The gray ice in his gaze had cracked, just a fraction. "Tomorrow," Thaddeus said, his voice rougher than usual, "I will bring more wood. The oven, it needs heat." He took the rest of the loaf, and the jerky, turned, and climbed the ladder to the loft without looking back. Eleanor stood by the fire, her heart pounding. It wasn't a compliment, it wasn't kindness, but it was an acknowledgement. She wasn't just a signature on a deed anymore. She was the maker of bread. She was the heat in the cold. She blew out the lantern and climbed into the narrow bed, pulling the buffalo robe up to her chin. The wind screamed outside, trying to tear the fortress down, but inside the smell of yeast lingered, a small, defiant promise of life in the dead of winter. The truce between them lasted for 3 weeks. It was a silent, fragile thing, built on the rhythm of chores and the exchange of necessary words. Eleanor baked, Thaddeus ate. She mended his torn shirts. He chopped extra wood for the stove. They moved around each other in the small cabin like 2 planets in orbit, close enough to feel the gravity but terrified of the collision. Then the winter truly arrived. It didn't come with a whisper. It came with a howl. The temperature plummeted so fast, the sap in the pine trees froze with loud pistol-shot cracks that echoed through the valley. Thaddeus had gone out to check the perimeter. A pack of timber wolves had been circling the ridge for days, the tracks bold and close to the stable. Eleanor was kneading dough, always kneading, her hands finding comfort in the resistance, when she heard it. The scream of the draft horse. It was a high, panic sound that cut through the wind. Then came the roar of a man, a primal, terrifying bellow, and the unmistakable crack of a rifle. Eleanor dropped the dough. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and ran to the door. She threw the bar up and pushed into the biting cold. The scene by the stable was a blur of violence. The gray shapes of wolves were retreating into the tree line, yipping and snarling. Thaddeus stood in the snow, his rifle smoking in one hand, his hunting knife in the other. He was swaying. The snow around his left leg was stained a bright, shocking crimson. "Thaddeus!" Eleanor screamed, the wind tearing the name from her throat. He turned to look at her. His face was pale beneath the beard, his eyes wide and wild. He took a step toward the cabin, stumbled, and caught himself on the doorframe of the stable. "Inside," he rasped, waving the knife vaguely. "Get inside." He limped toward her, dragging his left leg. Every step left a smear of red on the white ground. When he reached the porch, he nearly collapsed, but Eleanor caught him. She wedged her shoulder under his arm, her broad, soft shoulder taking the brunt of his massive weight. "I've got you," she grunted, bracing her legs. "Lean on me." For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't pull away. He leaned. He was heavy, a crushing weight that would have buckled a smaller woman, but Eleanor Prentice was built of sturdy stock. She bore him across the threshold and kicked the door shut against the wind. Thaddeus slumped onto the bearskin rug before the fire, dropping the knife with a clatter. He clutched his thigh, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. "Just a scratch," he lied through gritted teeth. "Wolf. Got lucky. Need whiskey." Eleanor ignored him. She fell to her knees, her hands already working at the buckles of his belt, not out of passion, but necessity. She pulled his heavy trousers down past his knee. It wasn't a scratch. It was a ruin. The wolf's jaws had torn through the denim and into the meat of his thigh. The wound was jagged, deep, and bleeding sluggishly dark, venous blood. But worse than the blood was the smell. Even in the cold air, the scent of something foul, something hot and rotting, rose from the tear. "The tooth went deep," Eleanor whispered, horror cold in her stomach. "It's near the bone." "Pour the spirits on it," Thaddeus growled, his head thrown back, eyes squeezed shut. "Bind it. I have traps to check." "You aren't going anywhere," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but firm. "This needs stitching, and it needs cleaning. If I bind this rod inside you, you'll lose the leg, or your life." She stood up. The fear was there, a fluttering bird in her chest, but beneath it was a strange calm. This was a body. It was broken. She knew how to fix broken things. She moved with a speed that belied her size. She stoked the fire until the cabin was sweltering. She filled the kettle. She found his sewing kit, thick needles meant for canvas and leather. She poured a generous amount of corn whiskey into a tin cup and handed it to him. "Drink," she commanded. "All of it." Thaddeus looked at her. He looked at the grim set of her jaw, the way she rolled up her sleeves to reveal her thick, pale arms. He drank. He choked, coughed, and drank again. "This is going to hurt," Eleanor said softly. She poured the remaining whiskey directly into the wound. Thaddeus didn't scream. He made a sound like a tree splitting in a storm, a deep, vibrating groan that shook his entire frame. His back arched off the floor, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the fur of the rug. Eleanor didn't flinch. She cleaned the wound with boiling water and lye soap, scrubbing away the dirt and the wolf's saliva. Then she threaded the needle. "Hold still," she whispered. She began to sew. Her hands, so gentle with yeast and flour, were steady with flesh and blood. She pinched the jagged edges of his skin together. She drove the needle through the tough muscle. In, out, pull, knot. Thaddeus passed out halfway through. His head lolled to the side, his breathing shallow. Eleanor kept sewing. She wept silently as she worked, tears dripping onto her apron, but she didn't stop until the wound was closed. She packed it with a poultice of bread mold and pine pitch, an old remedy her grandmother swore by, and bound it tight with strips of linen. But the battle wasn't over. By nightfall the fever came. It hit him like a freight train. Thaddeus tossed on the rug, thrashing against invisible enemies. His skin was scorching hot to the touch, dry and papery. He muttered in a language Eleanor didn't understand, then switched to broken English. "Sarah, the smoke! Get down!" he shouted, flailing his arms. "The roof is coming down! Sarah!" Eleanor tried to soothe him with cool rags, but the water in the bucket was freezing over. The storm outside had intensified, a white-out blizzard that buried the cabin in snow, sealing the windows and the door. The temperature inside dropped despite the roaring fire. Thaddeus began to shiver. It wasn't just shivering, it was rigors. His teeth clacked together with a terrifying violence. His body convulsed, his muscles locking up. He was burning up on the inside and freezing on the outside. "Cold," he moaned, curling into a fetal ball, looking suddenly small despite his size. "Ice, in the blood." Eleanor piled every fur she could find on top of him, the buffalo robes, the wolf skins, the quilts. It wasn't enough. The cold was winning. He was dying. She looked at the bed in the corner, then at the man on the floor. She looked at her own body, the layers of flesh she had cursed her entire life, the blubber Thomas had mocked. "Heat," she thought. "I am heat." Eleanor made a decision. She didn't hesitate. She stripped off her heavy wool dress, her petticoats, her corset, throwing the cage of whalebone into the corner with a clatter. She stood in her thin cotton chemise, shivering slightly in the draft. She pulled back the mountain of furs covering Thaddeus. She lay down beside him on the rug. He was scorching, radiating sickness. Eleanor pulled the furs back over both of them, creating a cocoon. She pressed her body against his. She wrapped her thick arms around his broad chest. She pulled his freezing feet between her calves. She pressed her soft, heavy stomach against his rigid back. "Shh," she whispered into his hair, which was soaked with sweat. "I'm here. I've got you." Thaddeus flinched at the contact, his muscles bunching. "No, too hot! Fire!" "Not fire," Eleanor soothed, stroking his damp forehead. "Just warmth. Just Eleanor." She used her weight to pin him down, to stop the thrashing. She used her abundance to absorb his shivers. She was a human furnace, burning the fuel of her own life to keep his going. Sometime in the deepest part of the night the delirium shifted. Thaddeus stopped fighting the invisible fire and turned toward the real warmth. He rolled over, burying his face in the crook of her neck. His arm, heavy as lead, draped over her waist. He clung to her. He dug his fingers into the soft flesh of her back, not to hurt, but to hold on. "Sarah is gone," he whispered, his voice cracking with a grief so old and deep it sounded like rust. "The fire took them. I couldn't hold them. They turned to ash." "I am not ash," Eleanor whispered back, holding him tighter, her chin resting on the top of his head. "I am earth, Thaddeus. I am here. I am solid." "Solid," he murmured. "Soft, cool water." He nuzzled into her, seeking the softness of her breast, the cushion of her shoulder. He sighed a long, ragged exhalation that seemed to empty his lungs of years of smoke. They slept like that for 2 days. Eleanor only moved to stoke the fire or force water down his throat. She didn't sleep. She watched his chest rise and fall, terrified it would stop. She listened to the wind scream, realizing that this cabin, this man, this terrifying life was the only thing she had. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died. The silence that filled the cabin was deafening. Eleanor had dozed off, her head resting on her arm. She woke with a start. The fire was low embers. She shifted. Thaddeus was awake. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling beams. His eyes were clear. The glassy look of fever was gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion. He turned his head slowly. He looked at her. Eleanor suddenly realized their position. She was in her chemise, which had ridden up her legs. She was wrapped around him like a vine. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her body, her large, imperfect, soft body, was pressed against every inch of him. Shame flooded her. She scrambled backward, pulling the chemise down, trying to cover herself with the furs. I'm sorry," she stammered, her face burning. "You were shivering. The rigors. I didn't know how else to get you warm. I'll get up." She tried to rise, to flee to the corner and hide her shame. "Wait." The word was a rasp, weak but commanding. Thaddeus reached out. His hand, shaking slightly, caught her wrist. He didn't pull. He just held her. He looked at her arm, the soft, pale underside of her forearm where the blue veins traced a map under the skin. He looked at the curve of her hip under the thin cotton. He didn't look with the eyes of Thomas Miller. He didn't look with the eyes of the town gossips. He looked like a man who had been starving in a desert and had just found a spring. "You stayed," he whispered. It was a statement of wonder. "I burned, and you stayed." "I couldn't let you die," Eleanor said, looking down, unable to meet his gaze. You saved me at the church." "I bought a deed," Thaddeus corrected harshly. Then his voice softened. "You saved a life." He tugged on her wrist. "Come back." "Thaddeus, Cold," he said simply. Eleanor hesitated. Then slowly she lay back down. She didn't press as close this time, leaving a respectable distance. Thaddeus closed the gap. He moved his massive body until he was flush against her side. He took her hand and placed it on his chest, over his heart, which was beating strong and steady. Then he did something that stopped Eleanor's breath. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hand on her stomach. He didn't recoil. He spread his fingers wide, encompassing the softness, the warmth, the very part of her she hated most. Thomas was a fool, Thaddeus murmured, his eyes drifting shut as sleep pulled at him again. Why? Eleanor whispered, tears leaking from her eyes to wet the pillow. He wanted a stick, Thaddeus grumbled, snuggling his face into her shoulder. A man cannot hold on to a stick in a storm. He needs an anchor. He squeezed her waist gently. My anchor. Eleanor lay frozen, the tears falling freely now. For the first time in her life she didn't feel heavy. She felt necessary. She felt enough. She curled her fingers into his beard, stroking the coarse hair. Rest, Thaddeus, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating a world buried in white. Inside, the wall between the mountain man and his bride had melted, dissolved by fever and the undeniable life-saving power of touch. The spring thaw arrived not with a whisper, but with the roar of a breaking dam. The silence of the high peaks was shattered by the sound of water, millions of gallons of meltwater cascading down the granite faces, turning the dry creek beds into raging torrents of white foam and churning mud. The air, once sharp enough to freeze the lungs, grew heavy and sweet with the scent of wet pine, spruce sap, and the deep, loamy rot of the earth waking up. Thaddeus stood by the woodpile, his breath still pluming white in the crisp morning air. He was shirtless, sweat gleaming on his back despite the chill. The jagged, angry scar on his left thigh, where the wolf had nearly taken the bone, was a puckered violet line now, stiff and aching in the damp weather. He favored the leg, shifting his weight to the right as he swung the splitting maul. Crack! The red cedar log split cleanly in two, the scent of the wood exploding into the air. Thaddeus wiped his forehead with the back of a dirty glove. He paused, leaning on the handle of the maul, and looked toward the cabin. Eleanor was on the porch. She was shaking out a rug, her movements efficient and strong. She wore a dress made of blue calico fabric he had traded 3 beaver pelts for in the valley. It was simple, cut wide to accommodate her, but she had belted it at the waist. She didn't look like the terrified, weeping bride anymore. She looked like the mountain, solid, enduring, and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the fragile porcelain dolls of Oakhaven. She caught him looking. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. Thaddeus felt that familiar tug in his chest, the anchor holding fast. Then the wind shifted. Thaddeus froze. His head snapped toward the ridgeline, his nostrils flaring. It wasn't the smell of pine. It was the smell of sweat, horse sweat, and cheap tobacco. Eleanor, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a command. Inside. Eleanor stopped shaking the rug. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his knuckles whitened on the maul handle. Thaddeus? What is it? Riders, he growled. Coming up the switchback. Get the rifle. Eleanor dropped the rug. She didn't argue. She turned and vanished into the dark interior of the cabin. Thaddeus limped to the center of the muddy yard. He planted his feet, ignoring the throb in his leg. He waited. Minutes later, the riders crested the rise. There were 3 of them. The lead rider was Sheriff Haig, a man with a tin star pinned to a duster that had seen better decades. He rode a weary gelding that looked ready to collapse. Flanking him was a deputy Thaddeus didn't recognize, a boy with a nervous twitch. And behind them, looking like a peacock dragged through a swamp, was Thomas Miller. The shopkeeper wore a suit that was splattered with mud up to the collar. His bowler hat was stained with sweat. He looked miserable, cold, and terrified of the drop-off to his right, but his eyes were bright with a feverish, greedy determination. They pulled up 10 yards from where Thaddeus stood. The horses stomped in the slush, their breath steaming. "Morning, Kincaid," Sheriff Haig drawled, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow. His hand rested casually near the grip of his Schofield revolver. Thaddeus didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the splitting maul. "We ain't here for trouble," Haig continued, his eyes darting to the cabin door, then back to the giant blocking his path. "We're here on official county business." "You have no business here," Thaddeus rumbled. "This is deeded land." "It is," Haig agreed, "but the status of the deed holder is in question." Thomas Miller nudged his horse forward, emboldened by the sheriff's presence. He looked at Thaddeus with a mixture of fear and sneering superiority. "I'm here for my fiancée," Thomas announced, his voice shrill. Thaddeus laughed. It was a dark, dry sound like rocks tumbling down a chute. "You left her at the altar, shopkeeper. You have no fiancée." "That was a misunderstanding," Thomas stammered, his face flushing red. "I was under duress. And besides, the marriage to you, a savage, a squatter, is invalid. It was coerced. Eleanor Prentice is a woman of delicate constitution. She couldn't possibly have consented to this filth." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the mud, at Thaddeus himself. "She is Eleanor Kincaid," Thaddeus said, "and she is staying." "She's which, you fool?" Thomas shrieked, losing his composure. "Her father died last week. Heart attack. He left the mill, the land, and $3,000 in gold bonds to his only daughter. Do you think I'm going to let a fortune like that stay up here with a bear?" Thaddeus went still. Rich. The word hit him like a physical blow. Eleanor was an heiress. She had a mill. She had gold. She could buy Oakhaven. She could buy a life far away from the cold and the wolves. "Eleanor!" Thomas shouted at the cabin. "Ellie, come out! Your father is dead. You're free. I've come to take you back to civilization. You don't have to be a slave to this animal anymore." The cabin door opened. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. She wasn't holding the rifle. She was holding a cast-iron skillet, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. "My father is dead?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, my dear," Thomas cooed, trying to sound sympathetic, but failing to hide the calculation in his eyes. "And he left you everything. You're a wealthy woman, Ellie. Think of it. We can expand the store. We can build a real house. No more squalor." He looked her up and down, his nose wrinkling. "Look at you. In that rag. You've gotten bigger. Living on bear fat, I suppose. But don't worry. I'm a forgiving man. With the dowry, with the inheritance, I can overlook the weight." "The weight?" Thaddeus felt a snap inside his head. It was the sound of a cable breaking under too much tension. He looked at Eleanor. He saw the shame flicker across her face, the old wound reopening. He saw the woman who had used her own body to warm him when he was dying, the woman who made bread from dust, the woman who was his anchor. And this little man, this insect, dared to weigh her worth in gold? "You," Thaddeus growled, stepping forward. The pain in his leg vanished, consumed by a red tide of rage. "You do not speak to her." "Back off, Kincaid," Sheriff Haig barked, drawing his gun. "The law says the woman goes back to probate court to settle the estate." "She isn't going anywhere," Thaddeus roared. He moved. For a man of his size, injured and limping, he moved with terrifying speed. He didn't go for the sheriff. He went for Thomas. Thaddeus launched himself at Thomas's horse. The animal screamed and reared, but Thaddeus ignored the hooves. He grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his muddy suit and ripped him out of the saddle. Thomas shrieked as he flew through the air, landing in the mud with a wet splat. Thaddeus was on him instantly. He didn't use the maul, he used his hands. He grabbed Thomas by the throat and lifted him, slamming him back down into the slush. "You called her a burden," Thaddeus snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You called her a monster. "Get off him!" the sheriff yelled. Bang! The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Thaddeus jerked. A line of red appeared on his upper arm, a graze. He didn't stop. He raised his fist to crush Thomas's jaw. "I said get back," Haig shouted, cocking the hammer for a kill shot. He aimed directly at the back of Thaddeus's head. Thaddeus didn't see it. He was lost in the feral instinct to protect, to destroy the threat to his mate. No. The scream didn't come from Thaddeus. It came from the porch. Crack boom! The sound of the Winchester 1873 was distinct, a sharp, heavy report that dwarfed the sheriff's pistol. Sheriff Haig's hat flew off his head, spun in the air, and landed in the mud, a neat hole punched through the crown. Haig froze. The deputy's horse bolted, throwing the boy into a snowbank. Every eye turned to the porch. Eleanor stood there. The skillet lay on the floor. In her hands, steady as a rock, was Thaddeus's buffalo gun. The barrel was smoking. She worked the lever action, clack-clack, chambering another round with a mechanical precision that spoke of practice. She aimed the rifle directly at the sheriff's chest. "Drop it," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't the whisper of the bride. It wasn't the soft tone of the baker. It was the voice of the mountain. It was deep, resonant, and absolutely terrifying. "Now, Mrs. Kincaid," Haig started, his hands shaking. "You don't want to—" "I said, drop it!" Eleanor screamed, stepping off the porch and into the mud. She didn't stumble. She marched toward them, the rifle never wavering. "You come to my home? You shoot my husband? You insult my family?" She stopped 10 feet from the sheriff. She looked massive in the blue dress, a force of nature. "Drop the gun, Sheriff, or the next one doesn't take your hat. It takes your head." Haig looked at her eyes. He saw no hesitation. He dropped the revolver. It landed in the mud with a dull thud. Thaddeus slowly released his grip on Thomas's throat. He stood up, breathing heavily, blood trickling down his arm, ignoring the pain in his leg. He looked at Eleanor. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. She wasn't hiding behind him. She wasn't shrinking. She was standing guard over him, a Valkyrie in calico. Thomas scrambled backward in the mud, looking from the giant to the woman with the gun. "Ellie, you're crazy! He's turned you into a savage!" Eleanor shifted her aim. She pointed the barrel at Thomas, who was cowering on the ground. "I am not Ellie," she said, her voice cold as the creek water. "I am Eleanor Kincaid, and you are trespassing." She stepped closer, towering over the man who had left her at the altar. "My father is dead," she said, the grief finally hitting her, but she shoved it down, fueling her rage. "And his money, his mill, I don't care. Keep it. Rot in it." "But the gold," Thomas whimpered. "The only gold I want," Eleanor said, glancing at the wedding band Thaddeus had hammered out of a gold nugget for her, "is on my finger. Now get up. Get on your horse, and if I ever see you on this ridge again, I won't aim for the hat." She fired a shot into the mud, inches from Thomas's leg. Mud sprayed into his face. Thomas screamed like a child. He scrambled up, slipping and sliding, and vaulted onto his horse with a desperate energy. "Let's go!" he shrieked at the sheriff. "They're mad, both of them!" Haig retrieved his hat, leaving his gun in the mud. He looked at Thaddeus, then at Eleanor. He tipped his ruined hat to her, a gesture of terrified respect. "Ma'am," he muttered. They wheeled their horses around and fled. They rode down the switchback as if the devil himself were snapping at their heels. The deputy chased after his horse, running on foot, slipping in the slush. Silence returned to the ridge. The only sound was the rushing water and the heavy breathing of the two people left standing in the mud. Thaddeus stood there, shirtless, bleeding, mud-caked. He watched the riders disappear. Then he turned to look at his wife. Eleanor lowered the rifle. The adrenaline crashed. Her hands began to shake. She looked at the gun, as if she didn't know how it got there. She looked at Thaddeus's bleeding arm. "Thaddeus," she whispered, the steel leaving her voice. Thaddeus limped toward her. He didn't care about the arm. He didn't care about the leg. He stopped in front of her. He reached out with his bloody hand and took the rifle from her grip, setting it gently against a stump. Then he grabbed her. He pulled her into him, crushing her against his chest, heedless of the mud, heedless of the blood. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her flour, sweat, and gunpowder. "My wife," he groaned, the words vibrating against her skin. "My warrior." Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him up, sobbing into his bare shoulder. The external threat was gone, chased away by the roar of a gun and the heart of a woman who had finally found her worth. But the threat of the truth, the inheritance, the gold, the freedom Thomas had offered, hung in the air between them like smoke. The adrenaline that had fueled the confrontation drained away as quickly as the color from the sky, leaving behind a silence that pressed against Eleanor's ears. The riders were gone, swallowed by the switchbacks and the tree line, leaving only the churned mud and the faint, sulphurous bite of gunpowder in the air to prove they had ever been there. Thaddeus stood in the center of the yard, his chest heaving. The graze on his arm was bleeding freely now, a bright red ribbon winding through the dark hair of his forearm and dripping from his fingertips into the slush. But he didn't seem to notice. He was staring at the space where Thomas had been, his eyes dark and turbulent, like a river rising before a flood. "Inside," he said. His voice was devoid of the thunder it had held moments ago. It was hollow. He turned and walked toward the cabin, favoring his bad leg heavily. He didn't wait for her. Eleanor picked up the heavy cast-iron skillet from where she had dropped it. It felt cold now, the heat of the morning's cooking long gone. She wiped a smudge of mud from the handle with her apron and followed him. The cabin felt different. Before, it had been a shelter, a place to hide from the wind. Now, with the door battered and the floor muddy from the intrusion, it felt like a breached fortress. Thaddeus went straight to the hearth. He didn't add wood to the fire. He went to the corner where he kept his travel gear, the heavy leather saddlebags he used for his trading trips. He threw them onto the table. Thud. Eleanor paused in the act of closing the door. "Thaddeus? What are you doing?" "Pack," he said. He didn't look at her. He moved to the shelf where she kept her few belongings, the comb, the spare ribbon, the tin of specialized spices she used for baking. He swept them into his hand. "Pack." Eleanor walked into the room, ignoring the mud she tracked in. "Where are we going?" "Not we," Thaddeus rumbled. He shoved the items into the leather bag with a violence that made the leather creak. "You." He turned to face her then. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the scars and the beard, making him look wilder than ever. But beneath the wildness, Eleanor saw a profound, crushing misery. "You heard him," Thaddeus said, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "The inheritance, the mill. You are a woman of means now, Eleanor. You own Oakhaven." "I don't want Oakhaven," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "I told him that." "You were angry," Thaddeus countered, his voice rising. "You were defending this." He waved a hand at the rough-hewn walls, the dirt floor, the dark, smoky ceiling. "But anger fades, and when it does, you will look around. You will see a cripple with a wolf-bit leg. You will see a savage who sleeps with a knife. You will see mud." He grabbed the saddlebags again, fumbling with the buckles. $3,000. Gold bonds. Do you know what that buys in the city? It buys a carriage. It buys a house with glass windows. It buys servants who will cook for you. It buys gentlemen. Gentleman? Eleanor repeated, the word tasting like ash. Like Thomas? Better than Thomas, Thaddeus roared. He slammed his hand on the table, making the lamp jump. Real men. Men who wear suits and don't smell of blood. Men who can take you to the opera. Men who— He choked on the words, looking down at his muddy boots. Men who deserve you. He took a breath, his shoulders slumping. You are rich, Eleanor. The world changes when you have gold. The town. They won't mock you anymore. They will bow. You can be the queen down there. You don't have to be a prisoner up here. Eleanor stared at him. She watched him frantically trying to pack her life away, trying to shove her out the door because he loved her too much to keep her in what he saw as a cage. She walked over to the table. She reached out and placed her hand over his, stopping his frantic movements. Thaddeus, she said softly. He froze. He refused to look at her, staring stubbornly at the buckle. Look at me, she commanded. It was the same tone she had used on the sheriff. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his eyes. Do you think the gold changes my size? She asked. Thaddeus blinked, confused. What? Do you think, she continued, her voice steady, that if I go down there with $3,000, suddenly my waist will be small? Suddenly my chin will be sharp? Suddenly I won't be Big Ellie? They won't dare say it, Thaddeus growled. I'll kill them if they do. You won't be there, she reminded him gently. You're sending me away. She took the saddlebag from his grip. She turned it over and dumped the contents onto the table. Her comb clattered against the wood. Her spices spilled a little. They will still say it, Eleanor said. They will take my money, eat my food, and whisper behind their fans that it's a pity such a fortune was wasted on a whale. Money doesn't buy respect, Thaddeus. It just buys silence, and I am tired of silence. She walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached up and placed her hands on his chest, feeling the heavy, frantic beat of his heart through his shirt. Thomas looked at me and saw a burden, she whispered. The town looked at me and saw a joke. You— She choked up, tears prickling her eyes. You looked at me and saw a wife. Thaddeus trembled under her touch. I am a broken man, Eleanor. I have nothing but this rock. You have me, she said fiercely. And I am heavy, Thaddeus. I am sturdy. You said it yourself, you need an anchor. If you cut the line, where will you go? You'll float away into the dark. Thaddeus let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. He looked at her face, flushed, determined, beautiful. He looked at her body, the softness he had craved in the fever, the warmth that had saved his life. I cannot give you silk, he rasped, lifting a hand to touch her cheek. His fingers were rough, stained with his own blood, but his touch was infinitely tender. I hate silk, Eleanor said, leaning into his hand. It pinches. I cannot give you opera. I prefer the wind. I cannot give you a gentleman. Eleanor smiled, then a radiant, tear-filled smile that lit up the gloomy cabin. Good. I married a bear. Thaddeus broke. The wall he had built around his heart, the wall that said he was unworthy, that he was too damaged to be loved, finally crumbled into dust. He didn't speak. He groaned and pulled her to him. He kissed her. It wasn't the chaste, desperate kiss of the fever dream. It was a claiming. It was hungry and deep and real. He kissed her with all the pent-up longing of a man who had denied himself the sun for a decade. Eleanor melted against him, her arms going around his neck, pulling him down. She didn't feel self-conscious. She didn't worry about her weight. She felt his hands roaming over her back, her waist, pulling her closer, pressing her against him as if he wanted to merge their very souls. He lifted her then. He ignored the pain in his leg. He ignored the graze on his arm. He lifted her, as if she were made of air, and carried her not to the loft, but to the big bed in the corner. He laid her down on the furs. He looked at her, his hair wild, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a fierce, possessive light. "My wife," he said, "my abundance." "My husband," Eleanor whispered, reaching for him, "my home." The storm outside had passed. The wind had died. But inside the cabin, a new fire was lit, one that would burn through the coldest winters the mountain could ever bring. 2 years later. The autumn air was crisp, smelling of turning leaves and wood smoke. The cabin on the high ridge had changed. It was no longer a grim fortress hiding in the rock. It had expanded. A new room had been added to the south side, bathed in sunlight, a sturdy porch wrapped around the front, lined with pots of hardy herbs and late-blooming asters. The path up the switchback was wider now, beaten smooth by regular travel. Not from the town, though. The townspeople treated the ridge with a superstitious respect now, but from the mule train that brought flour and sugar up and took the finest sourdough bread in the territory down. Eleanor stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was still large. She was still soft. Her hips were wide, her arms full, but the way she stood was different. She stood with her chin up, her gaze steady, the mistress of her domain. She watched the figure coming up the path from the woodlot. Thaddeus walked with a slight limp. The wolf bite would always remind him of the winter they almost lost everything, but he moved with power. He carried a toddler on his shoulders, a little boy with dark wild hair, and a laugh that echoed off the canyon walls. Thaddeus stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at his wife. His beard was trimmed, his shirt clean. The darkness that used to haunt his eyes was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows exactly where he belongs. "Papa, Papa, bread!" the boy squealed, reaching for Eleanor. Thaddeus swung the boy down, swinging him into Eleanor's waiting arms. She caught him easily, her strength undiminished. "Did you finish the fence?" Eleanor asked, shifting the child to her hip. "Done," Thaddeus said. He walked up the steps. He didn't stop at a polite distance. He walked right into her space, wrapping his arms around both her and the boy, surrounding his world in an embrace of iron and fur. "Sheriff rode by the lower trail," Thaddeus murmured, pressing a kiss to Eleanor's temple. "Left the mail in the box. Didn't look up." Eleanor chuckled, a warm, rich sound. "He knows better." "He knows," Thaddeus agreed, resting his hand on the curve of her waist, his thumb rubbing the fabric of her dress. "He knows the Queen of the Mountain keeps a loaded Winchester by the pie cooling rack." Eleanor leaned back into him, looking out over the valley. The town of Oakhaven was a distant smudge of gray smoke. It seemed so small from up here, so insignificant. They had their gold, not the bonds gathering dust in a bank vault in the city, but the gold of the turning aspens, the gold of the crust on the bread cooling in the oven, and the gold of the ring on her finger that caught the dying light of the sun. "I love you, Thaddeus," she whispered. "I love you, Ellie," he answered, the name no longer an insult but a prayer. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting the mountain in a purple twilight. The bear and his bride turned and went inside, closing the door on the cold, shutting out the world, and locking themselves in the warmth of the life they had built from the wreckage of a rainy wedding day.